All right, how are you doing? He's hoping that all is well with you. Welcome once again to yet another exciting edition of Debate 411. It's pretty simple. Always be or get interactive with us, and you can tweet, and the Twitter handle is at Debate411. The hashtag to use is Debate411. Today on the program, we're talking about the African Union, and the question we're asking, African Union for who? And has the Union lost touch with the African issues? These are some of the issues that we're going to be discussing or debating right here in the program. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. My panelists in the program today, we've got Benjamin, who's making another return on the program. He's a lawyer by profession. Welcome to Debate 411.
Thank you.
We have Archie, who is a journalist who will help us understand the African Union from the journalistic point of view. Welcome to Debate 411 once again.
Thank you, Eugene.
Yes, Dr. Christopher Kayumba makes another return on the show. Welcome, Dr. Christopher.
Thank you.
And we have Dr. Karambizi, who's an expert on international relations and also a professor. Welcome to Debate 411.
Thank you.
Right, so gentlemen, I would like us to start first of all by understanding what the African Union was created for, and then from that we can be able to ask ourselves the questions on whether it is actually performing to the latter based on those particular core values. And it was put together to propel, you know, a united Africa, and of course look at the issues affecting the continent and converge, form or find solutions to them, and, you know, sort out those issues. Today, as we speak, probably I'll start with the journalist who's always on the ground. And I know, Professor, you're also a journalist at some point. You also look at these issues. But Archie, based on your personal, you know, views on these issues that the African Union is supposed to do and what it has done or not done, do you think it's meeting this goal?
Well, yeah, based on the recent issues, I'd say it's on a case-by-case basis. There's a lot of failings that have been perceived by the African Union. Recently, on the question, for example, of African migrants going to Europe, dying at sea in the Mediterranean, there's been very loud silence, I could say, from the African Union. I think there was a plenary session at General Assembly, and almost no representative from African states showed up. But on the other hand, I think there's issues such as security, peacekeeping, where the African Union is taking, you know, big responsibility. In Central African Republic, there's an AU mission, AU peacekeeping force there, protecting civilians. I think that's an important step. And with regards, for example, to the crisis in Burundi, the African Union has been clearly the most clear international organization, especially on the continent, to take a stance, to take a clear stance. This is our position, and, you know, the Burundian leader should respect the Arusha Agreement. We haven't seen this coming from regional organizations like the EAC. So I think there's hope because the African Union is is improving, especially on these issues of security, conflict, and yeah, I think there's hope.
I'll be coming to Dr. Christopher, especially because earlier on before the show, you had felt that it has sort of lost touch with the population. But Dr. Karambizi, in your own opinion, do you feel that the African Union today is meeting that particular responsibility of propelling Africa towards peace and instability and prosperity? Is it meeting that?
Thank you for the question. I think to answer such a question, you have to go back through the objectives which were at the basis of the creation of African Union. I brought the African Union Statute here. We have on page 2 of the statute, from page 2, 14 objectives.
It had 14
I'm going to read some, and we shall try to see if those objectives have been achieved or not. So when we take, for example, the first one, to achieve greater unity and solidarity between the African countries and the peoples of the Africa. Could we say now that the unity and the solidarity are satisfactory enough between the African peoples? I think not. Because very often African peoples, when they are negotiating with the more powerful countries outside Africa, they do it in a separate manner, and this is a source of weakness. So I think here, of course, the African Union is doing something, but its achievements are not meeting the expectations. If we move ahead to the second objective, to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of its member states. Once again here, the independence of African countries is lacking something. Theoretically, our countries are independent, but in practice, they remain dominated by external powers. And the African Union should enhance itself so that it accelerates, strengthening I'm African, our 54 states, so that they defend their interests correctly, face the other countries. But so, without going up to the end of these 14 objectives, I can say that African Union is doing something, but this thing is so thin, so insufficient. And the African Union is accusing a slowness. It is slow. There is a delays due to the problems of the continent, and given our big potential in terms of population,
it is not working well in propelling this.
The African Union should be more strong and put in practice the objectives it gave to itself, especially because it is continuing the objectives of the former the Organization of African Unity. So we can say that the African Union is not old, 15 years old only, but more than 50 years old. So we need more achievements, more results.
Yes. Much as he says that, he's still neither hot or cold, because he says, first of all, it's doing something, then comes back and says, but, there's a but in there. Do you feel that the African Union today represents the values and, of course, the issues that affect Africa? And maybe we can go back to our key question today. African Union for who? Has it lost touch, in your opinion, with the Africans?
I would say, I would say to a great extent, yes, but also no, to a smaller extent. Largely for 2 points. Number one, let me first remind that the current African Union replaced the African Union. It replaced it in 2002. And when they were replacing the old OAU to AU, the objective was threefold. We want to change the organization that was seen as a talking shop, hiding behind non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, to an organization that is robust, that is more interested in the development of the continent, that is more interested in democratic transition, that is even interested in the affairs of each and every state. And they even removed that idea of non-interference. They even promised like 4 things. Number one, that no leader will undermine, will kill his citizens, will commit crimes hiding behind national sovereignty. Number 2, they put in place what was during those days African peer review mechanism. They promised that African leaders would peer review each other and look at who is, because among the objectives he was mentioning, there is promoting democracy and ensuring the rule of law. So they put together that mechanism.
And are they doing it today?
On that second point, there's clearly a failure, if I may. The promise to protect citizens if they are threatened or killed by different governments, as we saw in the South African case recently with al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, who was indicted by the ICC. There's no alternative to this ICC. I mean, there's a lot of criticism coming from Africa, which can be justified and legitimate, but what is the alternative to protect African citizens who can die at the hands of their leaders. So that
and this is where I bring in the lawyer here, because at the end of the day, there are those who say that, you know what, when it comes to issues to do with or touch on the sitting presidents of the member states of the African Union, if one of them is under threat, either ICC, they would quickly come together and try to come up with a communique to condemn that, you know, common enemy that is probably forcing or pushing them to have one of them indicted. But as you said earlier when we were starting, when it comes to African immigrants, you know, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to issues in different countries, there is silence. So, do you feel that Africans are on their own when it comes to issues affecting them, when they need to depend on the African Union to speak for them? Do you feel they're on their own?
Thank you, Bwana Nangwe. The African Union and the Africans in particular, of course, we have to put into consideration that when the African Union should be speaking for the African people. But then, because of the pressure and maybe the support the African Union gets from the outside world, as in I'm talking of the Western world, you'll find that it is like a dog without teeth. So it barks, but it cannot bite. For example, you'll find that most of the times, most of the budget of the African Union cannot be funded by its own member states. And Africans, you'll find that they are almost on their own. They are like a home without the mother. And as such, you'll find that there is no that coordination, that lack of harmony among them. And instead of being one solid thing so that they can raise up a certain common pool, you'll find that they are not doing the right thing. For example, you look at a situation where Omar el-Bashir, His Excellency of Khartoum, a warrant of ICC was issued. Ideally, a state, when it ratifies or signs an international treaty, it should be respecting it.
And it's binded by it.
Oh, yes. And it is supreme above the national laws. But you'll find that it is not clear to the masses whether these people sign the documents out of a no or out of maybe what they anticipate to get. When you look at a 2012 binary annual, I think, was it a summit that took a decision to transfer such a summit from Malawi to Addis Ababa.
2012.
Yeah, 2012. That it was out of Malawi failing to give an invitation to Omar el-Bashir because on a warrant that he's needed by ICC.
But they say the ICC is only targeting us. That's why we are uniting.
Why do we sign that document? Why do we ratify that document?
This is the point.
We don't want
this is the point. It is a problem of justice. The issue here is justice. And we have been promised that the African Union, that African leaders are going to ensure that their citizens are not killed by their own leaders. And once it happens, it is also in the interest of AU to ensure that justice is done. Remember, there is also the African Court of Justice. That court is redundant. Therefore, this issue of Omar el-Bashir, ICC intervened because
there was no alternative.
There is no alternative. Secondly, since most African countries, actually the continent has more signatories to the Rome Statute than any other continent.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, you cannot say that because we are suspecting that ICC is only targeting Africans and they have not gone for A, B, C, D. You shouldn't come for me. That cannot be an excuse in law.
I have to object to that.
Therefore, even taking that decision, they took a decision that ICC should not go for sitting heads of state. They even now have added that if when the African Court of Justice starts, they have excused themselves from what? From being followed. Who is committing crimes? Who committed crimes in Darfur? They are not ordinary citizens, farmers. It is leaders who are engineering. What is happening in Burundi? You know, if it goes out of hand, who will you blame? You wait for a president to leave office and you come for him? This is why this is one of the reasons some of the leaders don't want to leave office, because they have committed crimes.
And they fear they'll be looked for.
It is therefore the problem of failure to advance the issue of justice.
Is the African Union being unfair to its own citizens or the citizens of the member states by protecting some of these suspects who are being looked for by the ICC, using the disguise that the ICC is only targeting Africans?
Okay, to understand this problem, I think you have to locate African Union in the international context. We can't forget, beside the fact that within the international community, there is so much hypocrisy and so many negative behaviors. So I think African heads of state are justified when they protect themselves against the outside forces, because
they're justified.
This is so-called
ICC. They are justified to promote impunity. Because if you are saying they are, if the point
you have to understand the nature of this. Okay?
Professor, if you are making the point, if the point you are making is ICC is unfair, the outside world is unfair to Africa and Africans. But we agree that there is a problem of injustice. They should be finding their own court.
Alternatives.
Let me put all those things together. It would not be founded that African heads of state or African states use the pretext of the lack of fairness on the side of ICC to avoid solving problems. But also we can't forget to consider this issue that this so-called ICC is targeting one part of the world, which is not fair. Remember that
counter-argument
states, okay, let me finish. States like USA, like Russia, like China, like India, the poorest states we have in the world have avoided to be members.
They have avoided, but you cannot say, for example,
if
a criminal.
Be patient.
Let me
be patient. Let's have Dr. finish fast.
I want him to help me. I want him to help me.
Yes.
Can you go in a court of law when you are accused of a crime and say, yes, I am a criminal, but there are so many criminals. Why haven't you gone for that one and that one and that one? What do you think?
The court of justice have to ensure justice. If it doesn't not, I think everyone is founded to contest it. And it is what African heads of state are doing. If this court avoids to mix itself any business from the head of state of China and the other, once it considers one part of the air for the world, it is no longer a court of justice.
The key question
but coming back to home,
yes,
I think reacting on the side of heads of state, defending their rights, they have in the same time be sure to dispute justice to African citizens.
Because the actual bullet point of my question is, much as we're having that argument that, as you say, they are justified to defend themselves because the ICC or international community is targeting only one part. But where is the alternative? This is the question, because at the end of the day, as he said, there are citizens that are dying in the hands of their leaders. There are situations where we have catastrophes in these African states that are spearheaded or caused by their own leaders. Yet the African Union itself says there that we will have peer-to-peer review and ensure that nobody uses the issue of sovereignty, to protect themselves from being questioned when they are failing to honor the rights of their citizens. So where is the alternative? Because that is the key issue. Is Africa or the African Union failing on that end by not offering an alternative but complaining that the West is only targeting us, or the ICC is only targeting us, Africa?
Right, I think it is failing, but there's hope. And so let me first come back to something I heard by one of you two who said that the African Union was protecting the interest of African leaders by not sending them to the ICC. I wouldn't say that it's protecting their interest, but it has this principle that it is anti-ICC. So it is applying that principle throughout the continent. So we will not give in to the ICC.
Whether it's right or wrong.
Whether it's right or wrong, I think that's how I look at it. And maybe African leaders and people in the African Union understand that, for example, Omar al-Bashir is a criminal, and they understand, but they need to find an alternative indeed. And I think an interesting development we've seen last month. There was the beginning of the trial of Hissène Habré in Senegal, in Dakar, and he was a dictator of Chad from 1980 to 1990, and his trial is taking place in Senegal. And I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, it's not yet a Pan-African justice that we're seeing, but he's not being sent to Europe or to the United States. So I think that there's some encouraging things to see there, at least, that it's possible that African leaders will be judged by other African leaders, or be judged on the African continent.
Dr. Karambizi says that we are justified as African leaders to protect ourselves from the attack by the West, especially with the ICC. Dr. Christopher, on the other hand, says that, listen, why can we always be pretending that we are being targeted and not offering solutions? As a lawyer, from your perspective, based on this issue, do you feel that the African Union, I'm still repeating this question, has failed to offer an alternative to these issues? And can it even try its own, or leaders from the 54 member states, when it comes to human rights violations by the heads of states, if found guilty or if proven that they are really guilty of doing these things? Do you think this will even be possible?
Okay, thank you, Bwana Nangwe. First and foremost, as I said, the African Union, of course with its heads, the member states, who are represented by the heads of states. I don't know whether they always call the signing or ratifying of these documents as a ceremony, without knowing the impact it will have to impose on them, their rights and obligations they have to carry out. But to the extent where it has failed, of course, I say it has failed on a ground that when you look at the time when Haile Selassie of, I think, Ethiopia and Kwame Nkrumah had the idea of having the union in 1963, in 1960s, and then it came to be the OAU in 1963, you'll find that among the objectives, as Professor noted, it was among security, included security, the welfare of the Africans, and the robust coming up of Africans. But you'll find that all those years and up to now, apart from the proper way of maybe contributing forces to
peacekeeping missions,
but there is no permanent force that we can have, and we say that yes, there is a force of African Union. When there is a crisis in Burundi, it's there.
Yeah.
But we have to depend on the political will of a person or of a state. And it is so funny, you'll find that one state is having a crisis in its own, but is sending, because of money, other peacekeeping soldiers to another state. Since 1960s up to now, we have no permanent or a reserve force.
That's an interesting point, if I may jump in, because in fact there is talks and efforts to put together that force currently. You're right that it's still not there, but there is the talk of an African Union standby force with regional components the East African Standby Force, the West African Standby Force, and the East African Standby Force is the first one to actually be operational. But what does that operational mean? I mean, it seems just hypothetical right now, because are these soldiers training together? Are these soldiers mixed in from Seychelles, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya? Are they doing trainings yet? I haven't seen that. But this comes back to the question of financial independence, if I may, because you mentioned earlier that we still depend, the African Union still depends a lot on external funding. About 50% comes from the European Union. 50% of African Union funding, even the building in Addis was financed by the Chinese. And this points also to this question of the standby force. It needs more financing. That's what's missing to actually make it fully operational and not just hypothetical.
Because at the end of the day, Dr. Karambizi earlier on said that there is a 14-point, roadmap on what the AU needs to do, but he feels that we have a very nice document on paper, but implementation is always the problem. And of course, I'd like us, when we come back from the break, to move that conversation forward, and I'll allow him again to check through some of the other key points in terms of what the AU is supposed to be doing. And we'll also be touching on the issue of US President Barack Obama going to the headquarters, addressing the 54 member states, and for some people saying or calling it a lecture. In the hall, talks about term limits in terms of those African leaders who do not, who cling to power, claiming that they are the causes of the problems in their African countries. We'll look at those issues when we come back from the break. So let's just take this very short break, and then we'll keep the conversation going on that particular note. Keep tweeting, talk to us. What are your thoughts concerning the African Union? Do you feel that it interests you at all? Do you ever feel that it even concerns you? These are some of the key questions that we're asking ourselves right here on Debate 411. Use the hashtag Debate411. Tweet me directly at Eugene Anangwe, or you can tweet at Debate411. We are back in a moment. Do stay with us. And welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us right here on Debate 411. Right here, we put matters into perspective and, of course, have different opinions and debate them right here on the program. You can be part of it. All you need to do is use the hashtag Debate411 if you're tweeting. It helps us to mobilize some of those tweets, and we're able to see what you're saying concerning the different topics that we have here. Today on the program, we're talking about the African Union, and the question we're asking, it's a union for who? Is it really lost touch with the Africans, or is it on track? Those are some of the questions we're asking here. And we have Dr. Christopher Kayumba, Dr. Karambizi, Benjamin and Archie. Welcome back, gentlemen, to the next break of the show. Now, before we went for the break, we were touching on the issue of the ICC and whether African Union is, just protecting the interests of the leaders who are in power today when they say that, this court is just targeting our own. But there's a key issue here again, when it comes to the statements that the African Union comes out with, when it comes to, issuing a position on an issue that is affecting them, that is being said or done by the international community. And that, in most cases, some people have said, nobody listens. Just recently, with the arrest of General KK, there was a communique that was issued, and I don't know if any of you has seen any response on that communique from those who are being told the things that were said there. I'll start with you, Dr. Kayumba.
No, as you say, I think AU largely is ignored by the world, by the international community whenever it issues a communique or it gives a stand. For example, the stand they took on the President Uhuru Kenyatta stand, they said they requested the ICC to stay the prosecution of that case, but they were ignored. You were talking about the stand they took on the arrest of Lieutenant General Karenzi Karache. They also issued a statement. It's Peace and Security issued a statement. But as you say, we haven't had anybody responding to that. You know, so I think theoretically, Africa and the African Union is a good organization. It has good good objectives. But when it comes to three areas, does the world respect it and implement its requests? I think largely they are ignored. And of course, this is also a question of power, you know. Your will cannot be implemented unless you can cause whoever you are telling to fear you, to fear you.
Balance of power.
Balance of power. If there is no comparative, if there is no sanction towards non-implementation of your will, then you will be ignored. That is number one. Number two, of course, like my journalist friend here was mentioning, it is also a problem of finances, because the African Union is largely funded from the outside world. Only the EU is paying 50%. And of course, finally, that even Africa itself is not united in these stands. That is why I remember President Museveni has promised several times that he will cause all the members of the AU to withdraw from ICC. They have said it several times.
And nobody has done
Nothing has been done. And of course, as my friend here was saying, Malawi took a different stand. He thinks that if ICC has indicted a leader, that leader has to report and therefore clear his name. The same stand has been taken by Botswana. So even Africa itself is not united on this issue of
Dr.
ICC.
Karambizi, do you feel that the African Union as a union itself, does it have a voice out there?
Okay, I remain balanced, and I have to recall each and everyone that the respect we deserve is in accordance with the power we have. I think the source of the problems is a kind of lack of awareness on the side of Africans. Why, for example, should African Union wait for funding from Western countries?
Can it fund itself?
When we are
Can
rich,
it fund itself?
yes.
Can the AU fund its own activity?
The AU can fund itself from
Or if there is will.
budgets of the member states. But
Yeah,
there
but
is
I mean, AU, like the UN, can only be as strong as its members first allow it to be, and as strong they are. But
Yes.
if you look at African nations, including Rwanda, almost 50% comes from donors. So how can these countries
So I
that are
continue.
beggars, most of these
I
countries are
continue.
beggars, you know? So how can a beggar fund another beggar?
No, I object to that.
Why a rich state should be a bigger? It is here that we need a correction. African countries have to understand they are rich.
Are we
and
beggars?
using
Are
their
the
riches.
African states not
Yes.
able to sustain themselves? And so, based on his point,
They
we
have
cannot fund
a
the
big
African Union.
potential which can be achieved.
But it
in
is not currently effective.
Right.
Yeah, but
Right.
it can be effective in a small time.
And as long
It is a matter of awareness. So I think this is one point. African countries have to rely on themselves and make live their union. And it is possible within 3 years.
Kwame Nkrumah said that
But
in
I have to add
1960s.
another thing.
Let him add and then we
Let
continue.
me add
Yes.
another point.
Yes.
We have also to avoid diabolizing Africa and globalizing it. Africa is not a country. It is a continent made of 54 countries, and there are different situations within those countries. When we say, for example, that human rights are violated, they are not violated in all countries. There are some countries which are safe I can give you some examples.
But whether one or two, the African Union should be able to speak.
So in order to balance,
Yes.
you have to avoid consider Africa as an evil, consider failures, consider successes, and especially try to put in place a way forward how to correct, to avoid being totally pessimistic and say that everything
We can't.
nothing
He
can
says
be
in
done.
4 years we are able. If we want to, if we remain focused in 4 years, we can fund all these projects and tell China to say, okay, take back your building. We are constructing ours. Do you think that's practical?
Ideally, it's not on the ground that what we need as Africa, it's not that we are lacking resources, but what we need is the mindset change. Africa, most of the times we've been known and written about as a continent and a people forgotten by God, as a black continent, as I called it the Zenj continent, the land of black people. But what we can do, I don't subscribe to his school of thought, Doctor, when he says that how can a beggar fund another beggar? One by one, our people have it. One by one makes a bundle. If we can contribute one by one, a state commits itself for a national good and for the continent good. Maybe they put there $10,000 over years and years. We might not see it ourselves, but the posterity can make it. So it's not all that, it's not realistic when we say that this can be achieved in 4 years, but what I know is that it is possible and it can be.
Maybe I add a small thing.
Just before you add, let's hear from Kayumba.
Bwana Nangwe, the idea my two brothers here are promoting, that Africa is able, if it decides to, fund itself, fund its budget, fund its bills, I do agree. But what they are saying, Kwame Nkrumah said it in the 1960s.
And up to today, it hasn't seen the light of the day.
We are still depending.
There is no political will.
So you therefore,
I think as long as African states,
that's what I'm saying. When there is a mindset change,
I would therefore say we are good at talking. So advise us. I would want my two friends to advise us. How, when will Africa move from talking to doing things and to paying our bills? Because what you are saying, Kwame Nkrumah said it in the 60s. Nyerere said it in the 60s. Tell us.
And it doesn't see the
just
light
to
of
add
the
to
day.
your point, I just think as long as African states are
That's still talk.
fully
That's still talk.
yeah, yeah.
As long as
Yeah, yeah.
that's what he's saying.
As long as
we are good at doing that.
As long as African states are not fully financially independent, and the African Union as a whole, we can expect these lectures from the U.S. and Europe. They'll keep coming. Look at China. 20 years ago, China was getting lectured all the time by the United States on human rights issues, on democracy issues. 20 years ago, and now it's an economic power. And it doesn't get any more lectures. Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner of the US. It doesn't get lectures. So African states, leaders, citizens can be cynical about this. Why only us, we get lectures? But it's a reality. And as much as there's hope as to getting financially independent, it needs to happen. It's not yet here.
Okay. There are those who say that, I'll go back to the issue of the seriousness, the African Union not being taken seriously by the international community. There are those who have argued and said, look at the people that we have at the helm of the leadership of the African Union. Can they be taken seriously? This, I'm saying, the issue of Robert Mugabe. There are those who say that if you have someone like Robert Mugabe being the chairman or being one of the leaders up there, you cannot be taken seriously. Do you feel that holds water, that argument? That probably those are some of the elements that make us not be taken seriously when we speak as African Union?
You see, first and foremost, as I had already said, a need and a desire to have something is always important. It's not a matter of a person maybe being at the helm that's when we are not taken seriously. The question should be, what do we want as Africans? But when we don't know what we want, even probably where we are going, we don't know where we are going. So the issue of having people such as Mugabe it remains that is the fountain of honor. You cannot change that. And so there is no big deal of a person being maybe any figure being at the top of everything. That's when things will have to be bad. But I would like to not once again subscribe to Doctor's issue when he says that we are good at talking and when will this come? What Doctor should know is that I said one by one makes a band. Our people have it. For example, when we take an example of Rwanda, when we were from the turmoil of genocide, in 95, every system was broken down. But the president brought here a philosophy that Imvugo Niyongiro. Rwanda is not the richest in East Africa.
But my point is this, Anangwe, my point is this. From OAU to AU, it is more than 50 years because OAU was started in 1963. This is 2015.
And he said it took China 20 years only.
Why are you Africans not paying your bills? Why are you not paying AU's bills?
I talked of a political way. I talked of a political way.
This is of Europeans, of South Americans.
I talked of a political way.
Where is it bought? Where is it bought?
It's bought within us.
And my point is,
it's the matter of
when will it be actualized? This is what he's asking. When will that political will be actualized? That's the question I'm asking.
Once again, I think you have to avoid being too extremist in our statements. My colleague Kayumba has said that from 1960 up to now, we are talking as Africans, we are doing nothing. But
even some of them are still suffering from jiggers.
Okay,
so if
this is not true. Okay, there are some pieces of truth, but we have to understand that from 1960, the years of independence, up to now, we have done a piece of travel. To give you an example, in this region, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, in 1960, it said that we had only maybe one bachelor's degree holder. But now we have so many master's degree holders, PhDs, and so on. You can question me about the quality, but the quality also is improving. So we have built many universities. But we have enhanced our armies. We have built some industries. So the time of Nkuruma is not exactly the time of today. Of course, we have to question the fact that we are largely talking in this in a small way, achieving, but we are doing something. So I think we have to build on the small positive things and build the greater things, but to avoid recognize ourselves as new.
He's being optimistic and saying, much as not a lot is being achieved, but something is being achieved. This is what
I have not said,
allow us to move the conversation forward again on the promise we made before we went for the break, and this was on the issue. We've mentioned this word a lot, the lecturing. And US President Barack Obama on his trip when he was around, he addressed the African Union in a building constructed by the Chinese. And he said, you know what, on the issue of power, I don't understand why African leaders love staying on power, and not giving up power, especially when they're already rich. And he even said, the issue of changing rules between the game, if I personally wanted to run for another term in US, I will win. But I will not, because the law does not allow me to do that. Was he in order to make these statements that he made at the African Union?
I think, let me say that Obama has to be humble. Or the countries in the world are sovereign, and quite sovereign. None of them has the right to address lectures to another. Remember that in these recent days, in Charleston, South Carolina, in USA, a young white man has killed 9 black people. So the USA is suffering of his own problems.
So he should,
And
he was not
I
involved.
admit that Obama can advise Africa, but he has to be ready to accept advice from Africans on what is going bad in his own country.
So he should also accept lectures from Africa.
What is not normal is that those so-called rich countries are always ready to address lectures, and don't accept. They consider other countries as evils, and they consider themselves as a paradise. This is unacceptable.
And actually,
so I think there have to be an exchange of advices, and Africans have to be ready to correct what is going bad.
Kayumba,
but
was he in order to
yes.
make this statement?
Actually, for me,
Especially in the heart of the African Union, the
yes,
headquarters.
yes. Let us be pragmatic,
Yes.
realistic. How does power work? Power does not work on the issues of morality and respect. Somebody who has power conditions you even to listen to him, even when you don't want.
So he was in order.
This is how practical. I mean, if we were talking about respect and morality, if these things of if we're not talking about power, he was wrong. But when we're talking about those who have power and how power is exercised and how traditionally, from time immemorial, how power has exercised, those who have power, they even think that their tradition, their way of thinking, their institutions are superior, and they will force you to adopt that. So, what Obama was doing was continuing a long tradition of America and its leaders thinking that they have a superiority
Over the world?
Which
they,
is
they
not-
have the, they
which
have
is
the,
not
they have the
right.
right. They have the right.
But they are wrong. It is not
lecture.
It is a mistake.
Even tells, sometimes they even say our values. So it is not because in a moral sense he was right, but that is how power travels.
That's how power
yes.
travels, he feels. Was he in order to say this? Dr. Karambizi says, no, never. He should be humble.
Yes, respect the
and
sovereignty of
respect
other
the sovereignty
countries.
of other countries. But he says, that's how power moves. Do you think President Obama was in order to tell this to the African
Give
leaders
reasons.
at the heart of the African Union itself?
I don't agree that President Obama was in the right position to say that. Actually, I subscribe to his school of thought when he says that he should actually apologize. Because when you look, His Excellency Obama was not in the know and did not take into consideration of where Africa has come from. In any case, America, in my own opinion, has no moral authority of saying such. First and foremost, to have seen the atrocities that he has created. Since time immemorial from 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we see it in Afghanistan. And although it has taken 200 years to build its democracy, of course, remember putting into consideration the wiping out of the natives, the Red Indians. And so when you look at the situation of Africa, putting into consideration the scramble and partition of Africa, how Africa has suffered from enslavement of its own people, where Africans, sometimes even the blacks in the white man's land, do not know their origin, the African leaders and their people, sometimes they tend to fear, and fear is created in them that probably if we leave this seat, maybe something bad might happen on our people. And because of the atrocities and the problems and the havoc that has been created in some of the states of Africa, out of a result of colonialism, such as Rwanda, for example, that's why you see that their people still say that, why don't our people remain in power?
So
Okay,
in other words, he was in order.
He was not
in order.
Let
Let me have
add you
Archie,
one
then I
small
give you
thing.
one small thing,
Yeah, one
Dr.
small
Ali.
thing.
Just one small thing after Archie. Do you think he had the moral, authority and obligation to say this?
I have a tendency to agree with the doctor here. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have that moral
There are two
authority.
doctors. This one or the other one?
This is Dr.
Kayumba.
The Dr.
Yes.
Kayumba, he doesn't necessarily have that moral authority. The U.S. is, but the fact that the U.S. is more powerful, he's going to do it. It's in line with what the U.S. always does, and it's to be expected. I understand Africans feel offended by it, but it's the norm. It's always going to continue. And I think, I understand the lecturing, the patronizing, and clearly the double standards, because the U.S. doesn't go and lectures its other allies around the world who also commit abuses or don't respect term limits. But what's interesting, and I think somebody mentioned, the other doctor here, mentioned that Africans should lecture the US back. And there are some African states that already do that. So you have, for example, Chad, the government of Chad, that in the United Nations, Human Rights Council in the United Nations challenges the US and says, look what you're doing to your black citizens, look at the police violence, look at the torture in prisons and all this and all that. I think that's what African states could focus on doing more, instead of getting always defensive. Challenge the US back. You have that authority.
Talking of that,
because there are institutions.
Because we have only 2 minutes, and I want us to answer this as we add our final thoughts, as he says on challenging. Uncle Bob has suggested that Africa should form its own ICC to try George Bush and the others. I mean, based on what he's saying,
why not?
Counter. When they do this, you too counter.
Or on Gaddafi.
Should this be the way forward for African Union?
But
should we
before giving my position on this,
yes,
I wanted to recall that talking is easy, even on the side of President Obama, in achieving things I had. Every time when there is a visit from a powerful country, represented by a head of state, namely USA and so on, they
have
talk.
40 seconds to
but
go.
what is the quantity of means they make available to contribute to correcting problems?
So they only accuse, but they don't
talk
contribute.
Only. So I think African countries are right, are founded to show themselves tired of such reasons, which in a certain sense are empty of substance. And they want actions firstly from themselves, but also if you pretend paying enough attention to problems of Africa, you have to bring a visible contribution. If not, you keep calm.
Dr. That's all we have for you. We have 30, I'm being told here, we have only 30 seconds to and we have to share those 30 seconds. Yes.
About the creation of ICC, I think it is a manner of challenging the non-existence of international justice.
Yes.
It is not so necessary that each continent creates its own ICC, but it is necessary that the only ICC existing be rectified so that it meets the problems of justice on all the continents.
Super. Got you. Point home and dry.
3 points. 3 points, Bwana Moderator. First of all, the most important thing that I think Africa and Africans should do, and its leaders, is to put its house in order. Nobody owes them a thing. As long as they have not put their house in order, they will continue to be lectured.
Right.
Because that is how the world is not based on these issues of justice and I like you right and wrong.
So put your house in order.
Number two.
And that would be the only other extra one.
This thing of Robert Mugabe and putting ICC. I think that is what I would say blah blah. Really, because Africa has Africa Court of Justice. First fund that one and finally
make it functional.
Make it functional. And finally, I also think that the reason why we cannot lecture to Americans or Europeans, it is because in Rwanda they say, whoever has peace, somebody gave it to you. You cannot lecture somebody who is giving you peace. These people are feeding you.
So strings are attached, you can't do anything.
They are representing
Hands
you.
are tied.
So you cannot talk when they are doing they are giving you assistance. That is real politics.
Right.
It is not this thing. Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. But very briefly as we go.
So I think that Africa it's high time for Africa to know that we are no longer in those days when we have to be fed, but rather we should stand up because we've grown enough
African unity. Thank you.
Last point, I just wanted to point out to some encouraging steps the AU is taking. Again, to come back to Burundi, the AU has taken a strong stance. The EAC hasn't. The AU has observers in Burundi, military experts, and also has taken the lead on other regional issues, maybe South Sudan. And I would like, and I would like to see.
That's a thumbs up for you.
Yeah, I would like to see how the AU could even take the lead even more over these regional organizations when they are failing to address a conflict or an issue. And the AU, I have confidence that they can address these issues.
Daktari wants to add, but I think we need to have a round two of this.
I think we have to avoid to see Africa through all mirrors. Africa is positively changing, slowly but surely. It is a continent of a bright future. So, despite the problems,
we are moving on the right direction.
Yes, we are moving.
Thanks to the African Union or thanks to individual African states?
Thanks to of both.
Of both. Thank you. Asante sana. Thank you so much, gentlemen. We need a round two for this one, definitely. But thank you so much for your insights. Stop looking at Africa through the old mirror. Africa is moving despite the challenges that you see. Thanks to who? Both African Union and the individual African states. These are the words of Dr. Karambizi. Don't worry, because I didn't quote some of you, but it's all right, it's all good. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for the tweets and for the feedback. Debate 411, that's the hashtag to keep using. Let's keep this conversation going. We'll see you again next time. Goodbye for now. My name is Eugene Anangwe. See you later.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Anangwe.